The Whispering House. It started with a phone call that no one should have answered. In the suffocating quiet of her small apartment, Mara sat on the couch scrolling through the same news articles she'd read twice that evening. The room was too still, the hum of the refrigerator too loud. She hated silence. It made her hyper-aware of every creak and sigh of the building around her. When her phone rang, the sudden noise startled her so much she nearly dropped it. The number was unfamiliar, but local. A scam call most likely. She hesitated, her thumb hovering over the decline button. But something about the number, its neat sequence of digits, felt strangely familiar. Against her better judgment, she swiped to answer. Hello? For a moment, there was nothing but static, faint and uneven, as though the call came from miles underwater. Then a voice, barely more than a whisper. Mara? She froze. The voice was brittle, distant, but unmistakable. It belonged to her mother. That was impossible. Her mother had been dead for 3 years. Who is this? Mara's voice was sharp, betraying the unease clawing at her chest. Don't go, the voice said, crackling with urgency. Don't go to the house. The call ended abruptly, leaving Mara clutching the phone to her ear in the smothering silence. The next morning, a letter arrived. Mara found it wedged beneath her door when she returned from the corner store. It was an old-fashioned envelope, cream-colored, the edges yellowed as though it had been sitting for decades. Her name was written on the front in an elegant script she didn't recognize. There was no return address. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded crisply in thirds. The handwriting matched the envelope. The house belongs to you now. The keys are under the porch. The house. A chill rippled through her, unbidden. She'd heard stories about her great-uncle's estate, an isolated Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, but she'd never seen it. After his death years ago, the property had been tied up in legal disputes. No one in the family had wanted it. They spoke of it in hushed tones, as though even mentioning it might summon something best left buried. Her hands shook as she refolded the letter. She wanted to throw it away, to pretend it hadn't come, but curiosity, or perhaps a darker compulsion, begged her to see the house for herself. The voice on the phone was just her mind playing tricks on her. A glitch. Had to be. But the warning echoed in her ears, don't go to the house. The drive out there was a journey into desolation. The town's outskirts gave way to dirt roads flanked by dense woods. The trees pressed in on either side, their skeletal branches tangled like grasping hands. The sky was gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The closer Mara got, the more her unease grew, knotting in her stomach. When the house came into view, her breath caught in her throat. It was enormous, a hulking mass of decayed grandeur. Peeling paint exposed weathered wood beneath, and ivy climbed its walls like veins. A turret jutted out on one side, its windows dark and accusing. The porch sagged in the middle, and the roofline was crooked, giving the impression that the house was leaning in to listen. Still, there was something captivating about it, a beauty buried beneath the ruin. Mara parked her car and approached cautiously. Her boots crunched on the gravel driveway, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. Under the porch, she found the keys exactly where the letter said they'd be, tied with a faded ribbon. As she picked them up, a whisper, low and indistinct, seemed to drift out from the shadows beneath the house. She whipped around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and abandonment. Dust coated every surface, and the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the house settling. The front hallway stretched into darkness, lined with closed doors. An ornate staircase spiraled upward, its banister splintered and warped. Mara moved through the house with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. The furniture was still in place, draped with white sheets like forgotten ghosts. The air felt heavier with every step, pressing down on her like an invisible hand. In the parlor, she found a photo album resting on a side table. It was open to a black and white photograph of a family she didn't recognize. They stood in front of the house, their faces shadowed, their expressions unreadable. One of the children, a girl maybe 8 or 9, seemed to stare directly at Mara, her eyes too dark, too sharp. As Mara flipped through the album, she noticed something strange. In every photo, the house's windows seemed to shift. In one image, a curtain fluttered where it shouldn't have been. In another, a shadow loomed in the turret window. And in the last photo, taken at night, the house was alight with candles. Figures stood in every window, their faces obscured, watching. A loud bang jolted her out of her thoughts. It came from upstairs, reverberating through the house. Mara froze, her pulse spiking. The house is empty, she told herself, clutching the photo album like a shield. It's just the wind. But as she listened, she realized the sound wasn't random. It was rhythmic, deliberate, the unmistakable echo of footsteps, slow and heavy, descending the staircase. She couldn't move. The sound grew louder, closer. Her rational mind screamed at her to run, but her body was rooted in place, paralyzed by a deeper, primal terror. The footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and stopped. The silence was deafening. "Who's there?" Mara's voice wavered, barely above a whisper. The answer came not in words but in a chilling, guttural exhale. It came from the parlor doorway just behind her. Mara turned slowly. The room was empty. But the air seemed to ripple, and the shadows in the corners deepened, pooling like ink. The oppressive feeling intensified, a weight that crushed her chest and made it hard to breathe. Then she saw it, a figure, faint and flickering, standing just beyond the threshold. Its form was indistinct, like a smudge on old film, but its eyes burned like dying embers, pinning her in place. It raised one hand, skeletal fingers beckoning. Mara stumbled backward, the photo album slipping from her grasp. She tripped over the edge of the rug and fell hard, her head striking the corner of a table. Pain exploded through her skull and darkness swallowed her. When she woke, the house was silent again, but something was different. The air was warmer, stifling, and the light filtering through the grimy windows had taken on a sickly yellow hue. Mara sat up, her head throbbing, and realized she wasn't alone. The room was filled with figures. Dozens of them. They stood motionless, their faces obscured by shadow, but she could feel their eyes on her. The figure from before was among them, closer now, its ember-like gaze searing into her. The others began to move, their footsteps silent on the dusty floor. They closed in around her, their forms shifting, their presence suffocating. Mara tried to scream, but no sound came out. Her vision blurred as the figures reached for her, their hands cold and unyielding. The last thing she saw before everything went dark was the photo album on the floor, open to a new page, a photograph of herself sitting in the parlor, surrounded by shadows. Days later, when the police arrived to investigate her disappearance, they found the house exactly as it had been for years, abandoned, decaying, lifeless. But on the parlor table, amid the dust and rot, was a photo album. And in the final photograph, a new face had appeared among the shadows. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. Now, for another dark and haunting tale that will send shivers down your spine. It began with the smallest sound, the barely audible creak of wood bending under some unseen weight. Alone in her late grandmother's house, Lydia dismissed it as the old bones of the building settling after years of abandonment. The house, a Victorian relic perched on the edge of an encroaching forest, had been left to Lydia as the sole heir. Its inheritance was as much a burden as it was a gift. She had no idea why her grandmother, whom she barely knew, had left it to her. Still, the promise of a free home was enticing. She just hadn't anticipated how it would make her feel, small, vulnerable, and observed. The house carried a peculiar odor, not quite mildew but something heavier, like wet soil after a storm. Lydia had tried to air it out, but the smell persisted, clinging to her clothes and hair. The rooms were dim, no matter how many lamps she lit, and the wallpaper seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The house crept into her psyche, inch by inch, with its oppressive weight. The first few nights were mostly uneventful, aside from the creaks and groans of the house's aged frame. But then came the whispers. Lydia had always thought of herself as a rational woman, grounded in reality, but the whispers tested her resolve. They started faint, so faint she thought they were her imagination, a gentle sibilance just beneath the threshold of hearing. She told herself it was the wind, slipping through cracks in the walls or under the doors. But on the fourth night, the whispers became words. "Lydia." She froze in bed, her book slipping from her hands. Her heart hammered against her ribs and she strained to hear more. The house settled again with a low groan and silence followed. After several long minutes, she laughed nervously at herself. She'd been on edge since she arrived, that was all. Her mind was playing tricks. The next morning, she explored the house's attic, hoping to find something to distract herself from her unease. The attic was a cavernous space filled with decades of forgotten things. Dusty furniture, trunks that smelled of mothballs, and stacks of yellowed newspapers. Near the far corner, she found an ornate mirror, its silver frame tarnished black in places. The glass was cloudy but intact, and despite the grime, it called to her. She brought it down to her bedroom, placing it on the dresser. It gave the room a bit more character, she thought, a bit more life. That night, she awoke to the sound of soft tapping. At first, she thought it was rain against the window, but the sky was clear. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. She traced the noise to the mirror. Its surface was dim, reflecting only vague shadows despite the moonlight filtering through the curtains. She leaned closer, hesitant but curious, and her breath fogged the glass. As the fog dissipated, she saw something move within the mirror. Not a reflection, but something behind the glass. A shadow, impossibly deep, that seemed to writhe and pulse. Her stomach churned with dread as a faint whisper emerged from the mirror's depths. "Help me." She stumbled back, nearly tripping over her own feet. Her eyes locked on the mirror, but the shadow was gone. It reflected only her pale, terrified face in the room behind her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her phone, debating whether to call someone, anyone, but who would she call? And what would she even say? The days that followed were a blur of exhaustion and mounting fear. The whispers grew louder, the tapping more insistent. Objects in the house began to move on their own. A chair slightly out of place, a picture frame turned to face the wall. She'd wake up to find her bedroom door open, though she was certain she'd closed it before going to sleep. The mirror became the focal point of her terror. She tried covering it with a sheet, but the sheet would be on the floor by morning. She moved it to another room, only to find it back on her dresser the next day. The more she tried to ignore it, the more persistent the phenomena became. Shadows moved in her periphery, just out of reach of her direct vision. Footsteps echoed through the halls at night, slow and deliberate, always stopping just outside her bedroom door. Her grandmother's old cuckoo clock, broken and silent when she arrived, began to chime at odd hours, its bird's mechanical chirp distorted and garbled. One night, as the whispers reached a crescendo, Lydia snapped. She grabbed the mirror and hauled it to the backyard. She swung a hammer at it with all her strength, but the glass refused to break. Instead, it rippled like water, sending vibrations up her arms. A guttural moan emerged from the mirror, low and resonant, shaking the air around her. She dropped the hammer and stumbled back, watching in horror as a pale, skeletal hand pressed against the other side of the glass, pushing outward as if trying to break free. Panicking, she dragged the mirror to the forest's edge and buried it in a shallow grave. She ran back to the house, her chest tight with fear, and locked every door and window. That night, she slept for the first time in days, though her dreams were plagued by the sound of muffled screams and the sensation of being watched. But the respite was short-lived. The following evening, as she sat in the living room trying to convince herself that it was over, the television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, and a voice emerged from the chaos of white noise. "You can't bury it, Lydia," she screamed, throwing a book at the TV. The screen shattered, and the house fell silent once more. But the damage was done. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever, and the house itself seemed to pulse with malevolence. Doors slammed shut on their own, the floorboards groaned as if something massive was crawling beneath them, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. Desperate, Lydia searched the attic for answers. She tore through boxes and trunks until she found an old journal belonging to her grandmother. The entries were erratic, detailing strange occurrences and her descent into paranoia. One entry near the end caught Lydia's attention. "The mirror is a doorway. It calls to those who are weak, who are alone. I've sealed it away, but it hungers. We'll find a way back. I can feel it watching me even now." Panicking, she dragged the mirror to the forest's edge and buried it in a shallow grave. She ran back to the house, her chest tight with fear, and locked every door and window. That night, she slept for the first time in days, though her dreams were plagued by the sound of muffled screams and the sensation of being watched. But the respite was short-lived. The following evening, as she sat in the living room trying to convince herself that it was over, the television turned on by itself. Static filled the screen, and a voice emerged from the chaos of white noise. "You can't bury it, Lydia," she screamed, throwing a book at the TV. The screen shattered, and the house fell silent once more. But the damage was done. The whispers returned that night, louder than ever, and the house itself seemed to pulse with malevolence. Doors slammed shut on their own, the floorboards groaned as if something massive was crawling beneath them, and the air grew heavy with the stench of decay. Desperate, Lydia searched the attic for answers. She tore through boxes and trunks until she found an old journal belonging to her grandmother. The entries were erratic, detailing strange occurrences and her descent into paranoia. One entry near the end caught Lydia's attention. "The mirror is a doorway. It calls to those who are weak, who are alone. I've sealed it away, but it hungers. We'll find a way back. I can feel it watching me even now." As Lydia read, the house began to shake. The walls groaned and the lights flickered. A low, inhuman growl resonated from somewhere deep within the house. She ran to the living room, clutching the journal, and froze. The mirror was there, propped against the wall, its surface rippling like liquid. The skeletal hand had pushed further through, followed by an arm, then a face. Hollow eyes locked onto hers as a voice, both guttural and mocking, filled the room. "You invited me in?" Lydia backed away, but the creature emerged fully from the mirror, its gaunt body impossibly long and twisted. Shadows clung to it like smoke, and its grin stretched far too wide. She turned to run, but the house seemed to conspire against her. Doors slammed shut and the walls seemed to close in. The creature's footsteps were slow but deliberate, each one echoing with a bone-chilling finality. In her last moments, Lydia realized the truth: the house had never been hers. It had always belonged to the thing in the mirror, waiting patiently for someone to free it. Her screams were swallowed by the oppressive darkness as the mirror claimed its prize, leaving the house silent once more, waiting for its next occupant. In case you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support means a lot and helps us continue bringing you more spine-chilling content. The next story will have you questioning everything. Let's get into it. The rain started as a mist, clinging to the streets like a cold sweat. Marie Danton glanced up at the slate-gray sky as she stepped off the curb, her breath hanging in the air like a specter. The oppressive weight of the weather mirrored the heaviness that had hung in her chest for weeks. It wasn't just the city's seasonal gloom. Something had changed, in her, in the world around her. She could feel it in the hollow silence of her once noisy apartment, in the way shadows lingered too long in the corners of her vision. She adjusted her umbrella and walked faster, the echo of her boots against the wet pavement unnervingly sharp. Work had been brutal that day, a blur of spreadsheets and terse emails. But it wasn't her boss's nitpicking or the pile of deadlines that had her on edge. It was the dream, no, the nightmare, that had plagued her for 3 nights now. She could barely remember its details, only that it left her gasping and clammy, her heart pounding like it wanted to escape her chest. There had been a room, she thought, and something else, something waiting. The entrance to her building loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette of cracked brick and iron. Marie swiped her keycard, and the door clicked open with a groan. The fluorescent lighting inside flickered faintly, as if the electricity were trying to escape. She shivered as she stepped into the lobby, her umbrella dripping onto the scuffed linoleum floor. The faint smell of mildew, always present but never addressed, filled her nostrils. As she reached the elevator, she noticed the out-of-order sign taped haphazardly to its doors. Again. Groaning inwardly, she turned toward the stairwell, her heels clicking against the concrete steps. The sound echoed unnaturally, growing louder the higher she climbed. It was subtle at first, almost ignorable, but by the 3rd floor, it became impossible to dismiss. Her footsteps were being mimicked, a half-beat too slow, just enough to sound off. Marie paused, her heart thudding in her ears. The air was stagnant, heavy with an unfamiliar scent, something sweet and sickly. She swallowed hard and turned to look down the stairwell. Nothing. Only the dimly lit steps spiraling downward into darkness. It's just the acoustics, she told herself. Her throat felt dry as she forced her legs to move again, faster this time. Her fingers tightened around the stair railing, the rusted metal biting into her palm. By the time she reached the 6th floor, she was nearly running. Her apartment greeted her with its usual emptiness. She locked the door behind her, throwing the deadbolt for good measure, and leaned back against it, exhaling deeply. The familiar hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the clock on the wall provided a fragile sense of normalcy. She dropped her bag onto the kitchen counter and poured herself a glass of wine, the rich red liquid sloshing slightly as her hands trembled. As she brought the glass to her lips, a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, rhythmic tapping. Marie froze, her pulse quickening. It seemed to be coming from the window. Setting the glass down, she crossed the room, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. She pulled back the curtain slowly, half expecting to see a branch or perhaps a bird. But the window was empty. Only the faint outlines of other apartment buildings loomed beyond the glass, their windows darkened like hollow eyes. She turned away, but the tapping came again. Louder this time. It wasn't the window, it was the mirror. The antique mirror hung on the wall near the living room, a relic she had picked up at a thrift store months ago. Its ornate, tarnished frame was oddly beautiful, and she had hung it without much thought. Now the glass seemed darker than it should have been, as if it absorbed the light rather than reflected it. The tapping persisted, sharp and insistent. It came from inside the mirror. Marie's breath hitched as she approached the mirror, her reflection seeming too distant, too disjointed. She reached out, fingertips hovering just above the cold surface. The tapping stopped. Relief flooded her for a moment, but then the glass rippled. Not like water, but as though it were breathing, expanding and contracting in shallow pulses. Her reflection, a pale, wide-eyed version of herself, began to shift, its movements not matching hers. It smiled. She did not. A low hum began to build in her ears, a vibration that seemed to come from her bones rather than the room. The reflection's smile widened, stretching unnaturally, splitting the corners of its mouth until dark rivulets began to drip down its chin. And then it spoke. "Come closer." The voice wasn't hers. It was layered, as though a dozen whispers had been stitched together, each one more distorted than the last. Marie stumbled back, her legs trembling as the humming grew louder, more insistent. The air around her thickened, pressing against her like invisible hands. She couldn't breathe. The mirror began to crack, thin spiderweb fractures radiating from the center. But instead of shattering, the cracks bled, thick, black ichor that dripped onto the floor in slow, deliberate drops. Each one hissed as it hit the wood, burning small holes into the surface. Marie turned and ran. Her vision blurred as she fumbled with the deadbolt, her fingers slick with sweat. The lock finally gave and she yanked the door open, bolting into the hallway. The fluorescent lights above flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. The air was freezing now, each breath a cloud of mist. As she reached the stairwell, she heard it again, the echo of footsteps. This time they weren't hers. They were heavier, deliberate, growing closer. She glanced over her shoulder, her stomach lurching as she saw the figure. It stood at the end of the hallway, its silhouette barely human. Its limbs were too long, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Eyes like burning coals pierced the darkness, and its mouth was a yawning void, stretching wider with each passing second. Marie's scream caught in her throat as the figure began to move, its jerky, spasmodic movements defying logic. It didn't walk. It unfolded, collapsing and reforming with every step, closing the distance faster than seemed possible. She threw herself down the stairs, nearly tripping in her desperation. The walls around her seemed to pulse, the paint bubbling and peeling as if the building itself were alive. The sweet, sickly scent from before was overpowering now, making her gag. She burst into the lobby, slamming through the door with enough force to send her sprawling onto the floor. The receptionist's desk was empty, the chair overturned. The air was eerily silent. Marie scrambled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and ran for the exit. The glass doors wouldn't budge. She yanked at them, pounded on them, but they held firm. Outside, the street was deserted, the rain falling in thick, sluggish drops that didn't seem to reach the ground. The world beyond the glass seemed wrong, as if it were a poorly painted backdrop. Behind her, the humming returned, deeper now, resonating in her chest. She turned slowly, her body trembling, and saw the mirror. It stood in the center of the lobby, impossibly intact, its surface swirling with darkness. From the shadows within, something began to emerge. Marie's scream echoed through the building as the figure stepped out of the mirror, its burning eyes locking onto hers. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was its smile, too wide, too sharp, too eager. When the police arrived the next morning, they found the lobby empty, save for a single shattered mirror and the faint smell of decay. Marie Danton was never seen again. But sometimes, late at night, tenants swear they hear tapping on their mirrors. And if they listen closely, they can hear a voice whispering from the other side. Come closer. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more thrilling stories. And hit the bell icon to never miss an update.